Hi there, my name's Tony Park. I'm here to talk to you today about my 18th book, Last Survivor. I would much rather be out in the lovely Hawkesbury area of Sydney, but I'm stuck at home also in Sydney in the spare bedroom of my flat. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and a little bit about the book, and thankfully the library has sent me some questions. And the first question is, what is my background and what led me to write my first book? And to tell you a little bit about me, all of my novels, all 18 of them, including Last Survivor, are set in Africa. But as you can probably tell by now from my accent, I'm not from South Africa or Zimbabwe or any of the countries that I've written about in these previous books. I actually grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney. One thing I knew from the time that I was a very little boy was the only thing in life that I wanted to do was to write a book. My mum got me interested in reading at a very early age, and I firmly believe that it's the greatest gift that a parent or a grandparent can give to a child is a love of reading. And as my love of reading grew, I thought, wouldn't it be cool if you could write a book, if that could be your job? But it's not as easy as it sounds just to wake up one day and say, write a book. I mean, there's about 120,000 words in one of these. It's a fair old amount of work. As I went through school, I learned that very quickly that I was no good at maths or science, and the only thing I was really good or interested in was English. So I thought maybe I should write a book. Maybe this is the way for me to go. And then, but again, it's not so easy just to say I'm going to spend, 6 or 7 months or a year writing a book. So I've got a job working as a journalist. I worked in public relations, got married, got a mortgage, as people do. But bubbling away inside me was this desire to write. And it wasn't until I was well into my 30s that I said to my wife, I really want to write a book, and I think the only way I can do it is to leave work. And to my amazement, she said, yes, go for it. Follow your dream, try and write a book. So I did, and I failed. My first novel went nowhere. It was set in the outback of Australia. I'd never been to the outback. But I learned a lot from writing that book. I learned how not to write. I had read a couple of textbooks about how to write, and they both said that I had to have a plot. I had to know the beginning and the middle and the end of a book before I started writing. And I worked out that put a lot of constraints on me. It wasn't an enjoyable process. Around about the time that I had failed writing this first novel, my wife and I went on a holiday to Africa. We went on what was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime safari trip to South Africa, Zimbabwe and Botswana. And quite simply, although I don't really know how, we got hooked on this amazing continent with its diverse cultures and countries and amazing wildlife and friendly people and incredible scenery. And a couple of years later, I had another go at writing a book, and I did it completely differently. Instead of writing to a plot, a rigid structure, I found myself on our third trip to Africa in 1998, and I simply sat down at the campsite where I happened to be in South Africa and just started writing. I made up a story as I went along, and I set this story on a fictional tour that mirrored where my wife and I were travelling on that trip. And to cut a very long story short, that book was published as Far Horizon in 2004. And I got a deal with the publisher, Pam Macmillan, to write novels set in Africa, and here I am. If you haven't seen my books before, they're action, adventure, thrillers. They're for men and women. There's always a bit of romance in there. The next question is, tell us about your book, Last Survivor, which I'm very pleased to do. That's why I'm here. Like the previous books, Last Survivor is set in Africa. They're mostly contemporary. This one is. A couple have been historical. It's set in South Africa and Zimbabwe, countries I've written about. The one thing that kind of is common through all my books is I have developed a deep interest and passion for the natural environment and for conservation of wildlife and wild places and the environment in general. In the past, I've written about the plight of rhinos that are killed for their horns and elephants for their ivory and even birds like endangered vultures. But I was surprised to learn, and you may be surprised to learn, that the most endangered living organism in the world today is not an animal, it's a plant, or rather a class of plants. Cycads. These little things here in the corner, you may or may not have seen them before. Cycads have spiny leaves and They look a little bit like palms, but they're not. Their closest relatives are conifers because they have these large cones, which are like pine cones, but much bigger than a pine cone. They're often garishly coloured, and this is what makes the plants attractive to collectors. So the most endangered living organisms of the world are members of the Encephalatos family of cycads in South Africa. These are nearly extinct, or some of them are extinct in the wild. And the reason they're under threat or being ripped from the wild is simple. It's money. Wealthy collectors will circumvent the rather rigid rules that are in place that stop people trading in or exporting endangered cycads. And they fuel a lucrative but highly illegal underground market in cycads. The people we're talking about could be your neighbours. They're popular in Australia, these plants, and America, and parts of Southeast Asia and the Middle East. They could be my neighbours here. But unscrupulous collectors are so fanatical that they will pay upwards of $100,000 for individual plants. So in Last Survivor, the rarest cycad in the world, in fact one that's already extinct in the wild, is rediscovered. And it's taken by some criminals who plan on using it to fund a major terrorist attack, because sometimes crime and poaching are used to fund terrorism in Africa. A lady by the name of Joanne Flack, who is a member of the fictitious Pretoria Cycad and Firearms Appreciation Society. They're a group of aging gardeners and gun nuts, go on a quest to bring this plant back, and they're ably led and assisted by one of my recurring characters, a lady called Sonia Kurtz, a retired female mercenary who's been in a few of my books. It's a bit of escapism, a bit of fun, but it does have a serious message at its core about the threat to wild places, and a reminder that extinctions and endangerment are not just about animals, they can be about plants as well. I've been asked, I divide my time between Australia and South Africa. How does that impact my writing, and how has COVID-19 influenced my writing? Since Far Horizon came out in 2004, my wife Nicola and I have literally spent half of our life in Africa. We have a house in South Africa which we use as a base on the edge of the magnificent Kruger National Park. I very much write all of my books just as I did that first one, on location in Africa. So I draw my daily inspiration and ideas from the environment, from the people I meet, from the things I see around me. So I have found COVID-19 incredibly challenging because I'm trying to write another book now set in Africa for next year. But here I am in my flat in northern Sydney. It's not easy. Everyone is facing challenges, and I don't want to say that I am any worse off than anyone else. I'm lucky. I hopefully still have a job. My job now is writing books. Africa means a lot to me. It's my second home, and I'm looking forward to getting back. And I'm sure all of us are longing for something, but we must, stay together and make the most of where we are now. Where do I get the ideas from my books? The idea from Last Survivor came from a friend of mine who's an avid cycad collector, and not only was she showing me around her garden in southern Africa, I won't say exactly where, but she was explaining to me the value of the plants in her backyard. She also told me about a real-life undercover operation that was mounted several years ago by the United States Department of Fish and Wildlife, a 2-year undercover operation spread across Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Australia and America, that ended down bringing down a ring of real-life cycad smugglers. And the guy who ran that operation, who went undercover, Special Agent Ken McLeod, helped me with the research for this book. What genre are the books? Okay, if you haven't read my books, as I said, they are thrillers. There's a bit of action-adventure, something for everyone. I'm surprised to find more women than men read my books, perhaps by a narrow margin, but I like to think there's something in there. If you like a bit of an adventure, a bit of romance, a bit of adventure, and certainly in this one, a bit of escapism, because there's a bit of humour in there. How much research do I do for each book? To tell you the truth, pretty well none. I start off with an idea for a book. I do research later. But to start off with, I don't do a lot of research. Sure, I had to learn a little bit about cycads, but not much. In a book like Last Survivor and the thrillers that I write, pace and the story are the most important thing. So when I sit down to write, and I make it up as I go along, I finish writing my story, and if I don't know something, I'll just write check in bold and in brackets in my manuscript, and I'll later go back and find whatever piece of information I needed at that time. So I do my research in reverse, retrospectively, if you like. And the way I research is I find experts in a particular field or endeavour that I need to know about. So I was certainly helped in Last Survivor by a number of experts in these amazing endangered plants, cycads. But what I did is, because I'd already written my story, and if I went back and I needed to know, which particular plant would be the most endangered, or what does this plant look like, I do it after the fact, because I'm not wasting my experts' time by saying, tell me everything you know about cycads. I'm asking for specific pieces of information. So that's how I research. Do you know how each book will end when you start writing? No, I don't, because as I said, I make the story up as I go along. I would know sooner rather know the ending of a book I was writing any more than I would rather know the end of a book that I'm reading. So sometimes the end surprises me. If you don't know who the baddie is in my book, because they are kind of mysteries as well, then good, because neither did I when I started writing. And that's the way I enjoy writing. What am I working on at the moment? I am working on my 19th novel, which comes out hopefully next year. And it's also set in South Africa. And because I can't be there, the way I'm kind of helping myself get information for the story is by talking to friends of mine who are in South Africa at the moment. They're also in lockdown. They're in a very strict lockdown at the moment. My book will be set during the COVID-19 period, because that's what's happening at the moment. And as I say, I draw my inspiration from current affairs as well as places that I'm in. I've also been asked, who are my favourite authors? What authors have influenced your writing style? In Australia, I'm a fan and lucky to be a friend of Peter Watt, who writes magnificent stories set in our part of the world, in Australia and the South Pacific. And he's not only a great writer, he's a great guy. He's a volunteer bush firefighter and a former policeman. He's a very community-minded chap. I'm a big fan of a guy called John Gordon Davis, who is no longer with us, who used to write novels not only set in Africa, where he was from, but also in the United States and Hong Kong and other places where he had lived. I'm a fan of a South African writer called Dion Meyer, who was very kind enough to put a quote on the front of my book here. I won't say what it says because I'm too embarrassed, but he's a lovely guy. And I'm a friend of Catherine Howell, who wrote a series of crime-based novels in Australia, and a lady called Margie Orford in South Africa. Which authors have influenced my writing style? I don't know. I don't like to be influenced, and I hope I'm not influenced by too many people. I admire people like the American writers Nelson DeMille's use of humour in writing, and I aspire to be as funny as he is. Sometimes if I'm writing a book with a bit of humour, this is unusual, it does have a bit of humour in it. I very much like someone like Ken Follett for his grasp of his ability to put history into his novels. So yeah, I aspire to be as good as I can be. Am I influenced? Maybe not so much. Do I have any writing rituals? I find that what works for me is, because I'm not a very disciplined person, that I have to force myself into a routine. I think a routine, as boring as it sounds, is key to writing a book, because this is a big endeavour that you have to chip away with if you're going to write 120,000 words. And I write a book a year, which means I have to finish a first draft in about 6 months, because the editing process takes some time as well. I find I can do that by getting up, clearing my mind, maybe by exercising a little bit. I like to run and keep fit, or if I'm in Africa, I go for a drive and look at some animals in the national park near where we live. I like to empty my mind first, and then I write my quota, which is about 1,600 words per day. And I have to do that, ideally, every day for 6 days a week, and I give myself a day off. So that's my ritual. Do I have any tips for the aspiring writer? Just get into it. Just write. Don't spend too much time researching. Don't be daunted. Don't think that you have to have a plot before you start, and nor do you think that you should just make it up as you go along. You've got to work out what works for you. The most important thing is just write. I've also asked if I get writer's block. One way to avoid that is another tip that I will share, and that is set yourself a quota during the day, no matter how many words it is, 300 or 400 or 1,600 or 2,000 words a day, but never finish at the end of a chapter. if you're writing your quota and you do get to the end of a chapter, write the first sentence of the next chapter before you stop working that day. Maybe even stop mid-sentence, mid-paragraph when you reach your required number of words, because there's nothing worse than being confronted by a blank page when you start work again the next day. And if you feel like you're on a roll, but you've reached your quota, stop, because tomorrow might be a harder day. Leave a little bit of fuel in the tank. Do I have a favourite book and why? My favourite novel is a book called Hold My Hand, I'm Dying by John Gordon Davis, who I mentioned before, because I think it's the best book ever written set in Africa about love and romance and war. It's a great book. And if you're a writer, in my opinion, the best book about how to write is a book called On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft by the horror writer Stephen King. I'm not particularly interested in his novels because I'm not into horror books or the paranormal, but Stephen King's book On Writing, for my money, is the best book on how to write, and I reread that book every year before I start another book. Finally, if Last Survivor was made into a movie, who would you like to play the main characters? The characters are more mature people like myself, so maybe some actors and actresses who are not, 20, 21-year-olds. Far from it. So I think someone like Helen Mirren would be excellent as my leading lady. I've got a very feisty African lady from Zimbabwe. I think someone like Whoopi Goldberg would probably be fantastic for her because she could bring a bit of humour to the role. Is Charlize Theron old enough to be my leading lady mercenary? I like to think so. And for my hunky American hero, I think somebody suitably matured, like perhaps Harrison Ford, perhaps, or maybe even Robert Redford if we can lure him out of retirement. I hope you enjoy Last Survivor if you get into it. If you haven't read my books, I'd love you to have a look at them. If you have, thank you for your support and thanks for watching. And thank you very much to the library as well too. And I hope to get back to the wonderful Hawkesbury area sometime, perhaps for a future book.